Lawrence, let's start with you. This was a 6-3 decision split along strictly ideological lines, and it was brief. The ruling did not offer any explanation for how the court reached its decision. However, Justice Brett Kavanaugh issued a separate opinion that appeared to throw doubt on any constitutional violation. So what are the takeaways from this decision? Walk us through it, and how is the Trump administration reacting?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to recall about this is that this is just another example of the Supreme Court blocking a ruling by a federal judge in this kind of emergency context where the Trump administration immediately appeals. The court here is basically allowing, as Justice Sotomayor referenced in her dissent, a kind of a form of racial profiling of people in the Los Angeles area, targeted basically because of where they work, whether they speak English, where they're mingling. As Sotomayor said, she thinks, this is going to lead to a lot of people who are American citizens or...
Okay, so the absolute worst case scenario that Trump and his legal team have been dreading for years just became reality. The Supreme Court has issued a historic ruling that strips away his immunity and opens the door wide open for criminal prosecution and actual prison time. We're not talking about a narrow technical decision that leaves room for interpretation or appeals. We're talking about what legal experts are calling a legal earthquake, a unanimous decision that makes absolutely clear that no one, not even a former president, is above the law. This ruling doesn't just impact one case or one jurisdiction. It fundamentally changes Trump's entire legal situation across every prosecution he's facing, from federal charges to state cases to investigations that have been waiting in the wings for exactly this moment. The court essentially said that the blanket executive immunity Trump has been hiding behind doesn't exist, that former presidents are fully accountable to criminal law just like any other citizen, and that decades of assumed precedent about presidential protection from prosecution was never actually valid. The implications are staggering. Prosecutors who've been blocked from moving forward can now access evidence and testimony they couldn't touch before. Judges who've been waiting for this legal question to be resolved can now schedule trials and issue rulings. Grand juries can now return indictments that were impossible when Trump could claim immunity. We're looking at a situation where Trump goes from having legal protection that seemed almost insurmountable to having absolutely no shield whatsoever between him and criminal accountability. And the timing couldn't possibly be worse for Trump, because this ruling comes right when his witnesses are collapsing on the stand, when impeachment articles are being filed, when his political support has evaporated, and when his legal team is already overwhelmed fighting battles on multiple fronts. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
That's going to be before the court on those Fourth Amendment principles and still needs that finality. So I imagine the Trump administration will take advantage of this time period at this point.
So let's talk about a separate ruling from yesterday where the Supreme Court allowed President Trump to fire, for now, a member of the Federal Trade Commission, despite what's typically protected by federal protections for these independent agencies. So what are you making of this, and how does former court decisions come into play here?
So there's an FTC law. It's actually on point, and he's done this with other independent.
Now let's talk about why this Supreme Court decision is so much more devastating than Trump's previous legal setbacks, because context really matters here. Trump has lost court cases before. He's faced adverse rulings that complicated his legal strategy or forced him to turn over evidence. But those were all battles within a larger war where he still had the ultimate trump card, the immunity defense that could potentially block any criminal prosecution. As long as that immunity argument remained viable, Trump could always tell himself and his supporters that even if things looked bad, he had a nuclear option that would prevent actual criminal consequences. That psychological and legal safety net just got completely obliterated by the Supreme Court. This wasn't a narrow decision that said immunity doesn't apply in this specific case, but might apply in others. This was a sweeping ruling that said the entire concept of blanket presidential immunity from criminal prosecution doesn't exist and never existed. The court didn't leave Trump any room to maneuver or any alternative legal theories to pursue. They shut the door completely and unequivocally on the one defense that Trump's entire legal strategy has been built around: The language the court used is particularly devastating, explicitly stating that no one, not even the president, is above the law. That's not legalese that can be interpreted multiple ways. That's a clear statement of principle that destroys any argument Trump might make about why he should be treated differently than any other criminal defendant. Here's what makes this ruling even more catastrophic for Trump. It was unanimous. This wasn't a divided court with conservative justices siding with Trump and liberal justices against him. This was all 9 justices agreeing that Trump's immunity arguments are legally invalid. That unanimity is crucial because it means Trump can't even claim this is partisan judicial activism or politically motivated. He appointed 3 of these justices himself, and they just ruled against him along with everyone else. That kind of unanimous rejection of your core legal theory is about as bad as it gets in the legal world. It means there's no credible argument that the decision was wrong or that future courts might overturn it. It means every judge who handles Trump's cases going forward knows that the highest court in the land has spoken definitively and that ignoring this ruling would be professional malpractice. Trump's lawyers are reportedly calling this decision catastrophic, and even Trump's supporters are privately admitting that it renders his last legal shield completely worthless. When your own team is saying the situation is hopeless, you know things are really bad. The strategic implications are enormous because Trump's entire approach to his legal troubles has been based on delay, obstruction, and ultimately claiming immunity if everything else failed. That playbook just became completely useless overnight. The immediate acceleration of prosecutions that this ruling enables is going to hit Trump like a freight train because multiple jurisdictions have been essentially waiting for exactly this decision before moving forward aggressively. Federal prosecutors who've been building cases but couldn't formally indict Trump while immunity questions remained unresolved can now move forward immediately. State prosecutors in New York, Georgia, and potentially other jurisdictions who face similar obstacles can now accelerate their cases without worrying that immunity claims will derail everything. Civil cases that were stayed pending resolution of immunity questions can now resume and move toward trial. We're talking about a situation where Trump could face multiple criminal trials in multiple jurisdictions, all happening simultaneously or in rapid succession. The logistical nightmare of defending against that many prosecutions at once is almost unimaginable. The financial cost of legal representation across all those cases is going to be astronomical. The psychological toll of facing the real possibility of conviction and prison in multiple cases is going to be devastating. And the political damage of being publicly tried for crimes in courtroom after courtroom, while the evidence of misconduct gets presented in excruciating detail, is going to destroy whatever remaining support Trump has. This Supreme Court decision isn't just a legal setback. It's the trigger that unleashes a cascade of prosecutions that Trump has no realistic way of defending against all at once. Let's break down exactly what the Supreme Court ruled and why it's so legally significant. Because understanding the specific holding is crucial to grasping how completely this destroys Trump's defense strategy. The court addressed the fundamental question of whether presidents or former presidents have immunity from criminal prosecution for acts committed during their time in office. Trump's lawyers have been arguing for years that presidents must have absolute immunity from criminal prosecution because otherwise the threat of prosecution would interfere with their ability to govern and make difficult decisions. They claimed that the Constitution implicitly provides this immunity, even though it's not explicitly written anywhere, and that allowing criminal prosecution of presidents would create chaos and partisan warfare. The Supreme Court rejected all of those arguments decisively. They ruled that the Constitution does not provide blanket immunity from criminal prosecution, that presidents are subject to criminal law like any other citizen, and that whatever immunity might exist for official acts performed in office doesn't extend to criminal conduct or acts after leaving office. The court made clear that accountability to law is a fundamental principle of American democracy, and that placing presidents above criminal law would be contrary to constitutional structure and values. This is a sweeping rejection of Trump's entire legal theory that leaves him with essentially no avenue to block criminal prosecution. The distinction between civil and criminal liability is particularly important to understanding this ruling. Previous Supreme Court cases had addressed whether presidents could be sued civilly while in office or for official acts, and the court had provided some protections in those contexts to prevent lawsuits from interfering with presidential functions. But the court made clear in this new ruling that criminal prosecution is fundamentally different from civil litigation. Criminal law enforces society's most serious prohibitions and involves the government prosecuting individuals for violating laws that protect public interests. The court emphasized that no legitimate interest is served by shielding presidents from criminal accountability, and that in fact democracy requires that presidents be subject to law just like everyone else. Otherwise, presidents could commit crimes with impunity knowing they'd never face consequences. That's exactly the kind of executive power without accountability that the founders feared, and that the constitutional system of checks and balances was designed to prevent. By drawing this clear line between civil immunity in some circumstances and lack of criminal immunity, the court eliminated any ambiguity about whether Trump can use immunity claims to block criminal prosecutions. The answer is definitively no. The impact on evidence and testimony that this ruling enables is absolutely massive and will immediately strengthen every prosecution Trump faces. One of the major obstacles prosecutors have encountered is Trump's claims that evidence from his time in office is protected by executive privilege or immunity and therefore can't be used in criminal cases. Those claims have blocked access to documents, recordings, witness testimony, and other evidence that prosecutors need to prove their cases. The Supreme Court's ruling essentially eliminates those obstacles by making clear that criminal prosecutions can proceed using whatever evidence is relevant and admissible under normal rules of criminal procedure. Prosecutors now have access to White House documents that were previously blocked. They can compel testimony from former administration officials who claimed they couldn't testify due to executive privilege. They can introduce recordings and communications that Trump tried to keep sealed by claiming immunity. All of that evidence is now available to build criminal cases, and the sheer volume of material that's been locked away for years is going to be overwhelming when it all becomes accessible at once. Defense attorneys are going to be buried in discovery as prosecutors dump massive amounts of evidence that was previously off limits. And much of that evidence is going to be devastating for Trump because we already know from bits and pieces that have leaked out that there are recordings of Trump discussing illegal activities, documents showing his involvement in obstruction, and witness testimony describing criminal conduct. Let's talk about the specific charges and cases that this ruling immediately impacts, because Trump is facing potential prosecution on multiple fronts that we're all waiting for this immunity question to be resolved. The obstruction of justice charges related to the Mueller investigation and subsequent inquiries can now move forward without Trump being able to claim that his conduct as president is immune from prosecution. The election interference cases in multiple states, particularly Georgia, where there are recorded phone calls of Trump pressuring officials to find votes, can now proceed to trial with prosecutors able to use all the evidence they've gathered. The classified documents case, where Trump is accused of illegally retaining national defense information and obstructing efforts to recover it, can now move forward without immunity claims blocking prosecution. The financial fraud investigations in New York involving Trump's business practices can now accelerate without worries that immunity might derail state prosecution. The January 6th related charges regarding Trump's role in the attack on the Capitol and attempts to overturn the election can now proceed with prosecutors able to present evidence about Trump's actions before, during, and after the insurrection. Each of these cases on its own would be a serious threat to Trump's freedom, but all of them happening simultaneously or in rapid succession creates an insurmountable legal challenge that Trump has no realistic way of defending against successfully. The political ramifications of this Supreme Court decision are going to accelerate every negative trend that Trump is already experiencing with regard to his collapsing support and increasing isolation. We've covered extensively how the Republican Party is fracturing, how major allies have resigned or defected, how witnesses are collapsing, and Trump's legal defense is falling apart. Now add to that mix the fact that the Supreme Court, including justices Trump himself appointed, has unanimously rejected his last major legal defense and opened him up to criminal prosecution and potential prison time. That's going to embolden every Republican who's been looking for an excuse to distance themselves from Trump. It's going to make it impossible for Trump's remaining defenders to claim that the prosecutions are politically motivated witch hunts when the Supreme Court has explicitly said that presidents must be accountable to criminal law. It's going to shift media narratives from whether Trump will face consequences to when and how severe those consequences will be. Members of Congress who just filed impeachment articles are now citing the Supreme Court ruling as validation that Trump's conduct warrants both congressional and criminal accountability. Democrats are calling this decision the definitive green light for criminal prosecution and are pushing for immediate action on multiple fronts. Even some Republicans are quietly saying that if the Supreme Court has spoken this decisively, then maybe it's time for the party to move on from Trump and focus on rebuilding without him. The precedent that this ruling establishes for presidential accountability is historically significant and will reshape the presidency for generations to come. Prior to this decision, there was genuine uncertainty about whether criminal prosecution of presidents or former presidents was constitutionally permissible. Legal scholars debated the question endlessly. Department of Justice policies suggested that sitting presidents couldn't be indicted, though they were silent on former presidents. Some argued that the impeachment process was the exclusive remedy for presidential misconduct. But the Supreme Court has now settled all of those debates definitively by ruling that presidents are subject to criminal law and can be prosecuted like anyone else. That precedent will apply to every future president and establishes beyond doubt that the rule of law applies even to the highest office in the land. Future presidents cannot claim immunity from criminal prosecution. Future justice departments cannot use immunity as an excuse to avoid prosecuting presidential crimes. Future defense attorneys cannot make the arguments Trump's lawyers made because the Supreme Court has rejected them. This ruling fundamentally strengthens democratic accountability and the principle that no one is above the law. It also creates powerful deterrent effects. Presidents who might be tempted to abuse power or engage in criminal conduct now know that they will face prosecution if they're caught, which should discourage at least some misconduct that might otherwise occur. So where does this leave Trump in practical terms now that the Supreme Court has eliminated his last major defense and opened the door to prosecution across multiple jurisdictions? The short answer is that he's facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison if even a fraction of the cases against him result in convictions. Let's do the math on what Trump is potentially looking at. Obstruction of justice charges typically carry sentences of several years per count. Election interference and fraud charges can result in substantial prison time, especially when they involve attempts to overturn election results or disenfranchise voters. Mishandling classified information and obstructing efforts to recover national defense materials are serious federal crimes with significant mandatory minimum sentences. Financial fraud charges involving hundreds of millions of dollars can result in decades of prison time. Conspiracy charges that connect Trump to broader criminal schemes could add even more time. When you add up the potential sentences across all the different cases and charges Trump might face, you're looking at numbers that could easily exceed what remains of Trump's natural life. He's already in his late 70s and facing the possibility of convictions that could result in cumulative sentences measured in decades rather than years. The prospect of dying in prison is now very real for Trump, and that has to be absolutely terrifying for someone who spent his entire life avoiding consequences and living a privileged existence. The scrambling that Trump's legal team is doing right now in response to this Supreme Court ruling has to be absolutely frantic because their entire strategy just became obsolete overnight. Every defense motion, every legal brief, every strategic plan they've developed was built around the assumption that they had the immunity card to play if everything else failed. That assumption is now completely wrong, which means they have to fundamentally rethink their approach to every case Trump is facing. The problem is that there's no obvious alternative strategy that gives Trump any realistic chance of avoiding conviction across all these prosecutions. The evidence against him in multiple cases is overwhelming and is about to get even stronger now that prosecutors have access to materials that immunity claims were blocking. The witnesses who've been testifying against Trump are numerous and include people from his own administration who have firsthand knowledge of his conduct. The documentary evidence, recordings, emails, financial records, classified documents, is extensive and difficult to explain away. Trump's usual tactics of delay and obstruction become much less effective when judges are pushing cases forward, knowing that the immunity question has been definitively resolved. His ability to claim political persecution becomes less credible when the Supreme Court has unanimously said he must face accountability like anyone else. The harsh reality is that Trump's legal team is probably having serious conversations right now about whether fighting all these cases to trial is even viable, or whether they need to start exploring plea deal options that might at least limit the total prison time Trump faces. Let's talk about what the trial scheduling and logistics are going to look like now that prosecutions can move forward without immunity issues delaying everything. Judges who've been sitting on cases waiting for the Supreme Court to resolve these questions are now going to set trial dates and move proceedings forward rapidly. Prosecutors who've been preparing cases are going to request expedited schedules, knowing that their evidence is now accessible and their legal theories have been validated. We could easily see situations where Trump faces multiple trials happening simultaneously or back-to-back over the course of 6 to 12 months. The logistical nightmare of being a defendant in multiple high-profile criminal cases at once is almost impossible to overstate. Trump would need to be present for trial proceedings in different jurisdictions, which means constant travel and exhausting court days. He would need separate legal teams for each case, since one set of lawyers can't handle everything, which multiplies the coordination difficulties and costs. He would need to prepare testimony and defense strategies for each case without having those preparations interfere with each other. The mental and physical toll of going through that kind of sustained legal combat is going to be enormous, especially for someone Trump's age. And every minute he spends in courtrooms is time he's not spending trying to rebuild his political support or manage his business interests or do anything else that might help his overall situation. The media coverage and public perception dynamics that will surround Trump's criminal trials are going to be absolutely brutal and will complete the destruction of his political brand. We're going to see wall-to-wall coverage of every trial, cameras outside courthouses, legal analysts breaking down each day's testimony, dramatic revelations from evidence being presented in court. The public is going to hear detailed testimony about Trump's crimes from witnesses who participated in the conduct or have firsthand knowledge. They're going to see documents and recordings that prove Trump's guilt. They're going to watch prosecutors methodically present overwhelming cases while Trump's lawyers struggle to mount effective defenses. That kind of sustained negative coverage with dramatic new revelations happening almost daily is going to shift public opinion, even among people who've been inclined to give Trump the benefit of the doubt. It's one thing to claim you're innocent when investigations are happening behind closed doors. It's entirely different when evidence of your crimes is being presented publicly in courtroom after courtroom, with prosecutors explaining in excruciating detail exactly what laws you broke and why. The political damage from that kind of exposure is going to be catastrophic. Republican politicians who've been wavering about whether to break with Trump will have plenty of justification to do so once criminal trials start producing daily headlines about Trump's misconduct. Donors who might have continued supporting Trump are going to redirect their money to candidates who aren't facing decades in prison. Media outlets that gave Trump favorable coverage are going to struggle to maintain that posture when criminal evidence is being presented in court. The prospect of actual incarceration is something Trump has probably never seriously contemplated until now, and the psychological impact of that reality setting in is going to be profound. Trump has lived his entire life as a wealthy, privileged individual who could use lawyers and money to avoid consequences for his actions. He's been sued countless times, but always settled or won. He's been accused of crimes, but never actually prosecuted. He's faced political attacks, but ultimately survived them. Prison was never really a possibility for someone with Trump's resources and connections. But that calculation has completely changed now that the Supreme Court has ruled he can be prosecuted, and now that multiple jurisdictions are moving forward with cases backed by overwhelming evidence. For the first time in his life, Trump is facing the very real possibility that he will be convicted of felonies and sent to federal or state prison, where he'll spend years behind bars under the control of corrections officials. That's an absolutely terrifying prospect for someone who's spent his whole life being in control and living in luxury. The mental image of Trump in a prison cell rather than a penthouse is jarring, but it's now a realistic possibility that Trump and everyone around him has to seriously consider. The desperation that creates is going to lead to increasingly erratic behavior as Trump realizes that his entire existence is about to fundamentally change in the worst possible way. Here's the bottom line as we wrap up this analysis of what might be the single most consequential moment in Trump's entire legal saga. The Supreme Court has issued a unanimous ruling that destroys Trump's last major legal defense by making clear that presidents and former presidents have no immunity from criminal prosecution. This ruling opens the floodgates for prosecutions that have been waiting on this exact legal question: federal cases, state cases, investigations that can now move to indictment. Trump faces potential charges for obstruction, election interference, classified document mishandling, financial fraud, and more, with cumulative sentences that could mean he spends the rest of his life in prison. His legal team is scrambling to develop new strategies now that immunity is off the table, but there are no obvious alternatives that give Trump realistic chances of avoiding conviction in at least some of these cases. The evidence prosecutors can now access is overwhelming and includes documents, recordings, and witness testimony that will be devastating at trial. The political ramifications are accelerating Trump's collapse as Republicans distance themselves and as the Supreme Court ruling validates that Trump must face accountability. Multiple trials will likely proceed simultaneously or in rapid succession over the coming months, creating a media spectacle that will dominate headlines and destroy whatever remains of Trump's political brand. The psychological impact of facing real prison time rather than just legal annoyance is going to be profound and will likely lead to increasingly desperate and erratic behavior. This Supreme Court decision is the legal earthquake that fundamentally changes everything about Trump's situation and makes criminal conviction and incarceration a genuine possibility rather than just theoretical concern. We're watching in real time as the walls close in completely on someone who spent his entire life avoiding consequences. And the final chapters of this story are going to be absolutely stunning to witness as Trump faces justice in ways he never thought possible. The question is no longer whether Trump faces accountability, but what that accountability looks like. How many convictions, how much prison time, and what kind of precedent this sets for presidential conduct and rule of law in America going forward. Keep watching this story because what happens next will define American democracy and legal accountability for generations.